Purgatorio, a term meaning a place of cleansing or purification, forms the middle section of Dante's poem. It functions as a zone of passage between the world of hell, with all the evil already encountered, and the realm of glory that will later be revealed in Paradise. In Dante's understanding, purgatory belongs to human geography. Medieval geography imagines two hemispheres, the northern hemisphere, which human beings inhabit, and the southern hemisphere, where the island of Purgatory is located. Purgatory comes into being when Lucifer falls, an event that causes the earth to shudder and withdraw, creating the void that becomes Hades, the abyss, while on the opposite side, in the southern hemisphere, the island of Purgatory rises from the sea. At the summit of this mountain stands the Garden of Eden, the place where God first placed Adam and Eve. In this sense, Purgatory is literally a location on the map. Seen this way, Purgatory belongs to human geography, yet it has remained historically unreachable by human beings. A figure already encountered, Ulysses, in Inferno Canto 26, attempts to approach an island, which can later be understood as the island of Purgatory, imagined as a place of immortality that he desires but cannot attain. His voyage ends in disaster, with a shipwreck. This island is not intended to be reached by purely human effort. In its structure, Dante's Purgatory is divided into three parts. The first is known as Ante-Purgatory, the region where souls wait before they can move upward. These souls are not yet actively repenting, but are instead awaiting assignment to a specific ledge. Next come the penitents who are about to undergo the process of cleansing. Finally, there are those who pass through the various terraces, beginning with pride and ending with lust, just before the pilgrim enters the Garden of Eden. The sequence of sins is the exact reverse of the order found in Inferno. Here the ascent starts with a spiritual or intellectual sin, pride, and concludes with the most bodily and material of sins, lust. Purgatory also possesses a crucial moral dimension. It marks the beginning of the reconstruction of the human, and for this reason it is placed immediately after hell. Only by knowing and, as far as possible through Dante's poetry, experiencing the nature of evil and its horror can one begin to appreciate the good toward which the pilgrim ascends. In Inferno, moral and political life appeared satanic, constricted, and terrifying, leaving Dante with the difficult task of explaining how a moral world, and then a political world, might be rebuilt. He came close to rejecting history and politics altogether, and now must confront the question of whether reconstruction is possible at all. His response is to return, quite literally, to the natural world. There is no expectation of an external redemptive force dictating how human beings should act. Instead, the natural world itself must be capable of generating, from within, at least the seeds of a desire for the good. This self-sufficiency becomes both a central element of Dante's approach and a source of the challenges he faces in carrying it out. Another defining feature of Purgatory, entirely absent from Inferno, is a sense of time. In hell, time functions only as the biological clock of the pilgrim, who is the sole living being there and the only truly displaced figure throughout the first part of the poem. In Purgatorio, however, every figure is displaced. The world thus becomes more recognizably human, and the souls possess an awareness of time. Indeed, the very first lesson offered in Purgatory concerns the nature of time itself. In Inferno, the present has no real dimension. There is knowledge only of the past and the future. In Purgatorio, time is experienced existentially, understood as oriented toward the future, as a projection forward, while simultaneously involving a return to the past. As the pilgrim advances, he gradually realizes that he is also moving backward, toward the Garden of Eden, the very place where God placed Adam and Eve in Genesis. This conception of time becomes a recurring theme throughout Purgatory. The relationship between past and future is constantly examined. Even the past was once a future. Ultimately, the future becomes what truly matters, and the way it is shaped by the past becomes Dante's central concern as the pilgrim ascends the various ledges of Purgatory. This raises the question of when, exactly, the pilgrim's journey is taking place, What constitutes the present moment? The narrative of the Divine Comedy begins on Holy Thursday, with Dante spending the night in the dark wood, but the actual journey begins on Good Friday, deliberately echoing Christ's descent into hell and emergence into the light on Easter Sunday. The scene now opens on Easter Sunday morning. Inferno began at dusk, with the encroaching night symbolizing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Purgatorio, by contrast, begins at dawn. As a result, the first canto of Purgatorio takes the form of what Provençal literature calls an aubade, a dawn song. Yet this song reverses the traditional use of dawn in Provençal erotic lyric, where morning signals the sorrowful separation of lovers. Here, dawn is restored as a moment of renewal, the time when the pilgrim can finally move forward and the poet can continue the careful mapping of the journey. The second part of the comedy opens with the image of water, establishing a theme of cleansing and purification. Dante speaks of sailing over better waters, as the small vessel of his genius raises its sails and leaves behind a sea marked by cruelty. He announces that he will sing of the second realm, where the human spirit is purified and made ready to ascend to heaven, and he calls upon the holy muses to let poetry live again, invoking Calliope to accompany his song with a power once so overwhelming that it drove the wretched daughters of Pyrrhus to despair of forgiveness. This opening functions as a brilliant introduction to Purgatorio for several reasons. It resumes the epic metaphor of the journey that began with the words spoken in the middle of the journey of life. At the same time, it recalls another sea voyage, the fatal journey of Ulysses. Particular attention is drawn to the comparative phrase, better waters, which emphasizes that this journey represents an improvement, though not yet the best possible state. It is neither the worst nor the ultimate destination, but a passage towards something better. Dante presents a world structured by degrees, grounded in hierarchy, of values, of states of being, of powers, of beauty, and of intellect. His vision is never simply divided between good and evil. Instead, it allows for multiple stages and mediations on the path toward paradise, an idea already conveyed through a single adjective. Moreover, this is not only the journey of a pilgrim, but also the journey of poetry itself. By referring to the small vessel of his genius, a conventional image for poetic creation, Dante understands a motif that will remain essential throughout the poem. There is no sharp break between the pilgrim's journey and the poet's journey. The poetic journey extends the physical one and becomes, in its own right, a process of knowledge and discovery. Poetry is presented not merely as a record of what has been, but as an active force of understanding. This opening also marks the first use of the future tense in the poem, with a declaration that he will sing. The reader is thus brought into a world open to futurity. To think meaningfully about the future requires belief in novelty, in the possibility of difference. If the future were identical to the present, it would cease to exist as future and collapse into sameness. By using the future tense, Dante suggests an alternative, a space for change, and the possibility of acting and imagining in new ways. Purgatorio thus signals a fresh beginning, for thought, for imagination, and for poetry itself. This could not be stated in Inferno, nor could it be expressed in the Vita Nuova. That earlier autobiographical work never uses the future tense. It is entirely shaped by memory, with all the risks and distortions memory can bring, drawing the mind into a realm of phantoms. The future appears there only in connection with death, when Dante experiences a prophetic dream and hears an oracular voice announcing his own mortality. Beatrice has just died, and her death awakens in him an acute awareness of the threat of death itself. The Vita Nuova closes with a declaration of hope, the hope of working and writing in such a way as to say of Beatrice what had never been said of any woman before. These are the only two forms the future takes in that book, either as death or as a distant, aspirational promise of writing. In Purgatorio, Dante turns instead to a prayer addressed to the Muses, in keeping with the epic tradition, and he invokes in particular Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. This emphasis on Calliope clarifies the earlier declaration at the opening of Purgatorio that dead poetry should rise again. Since Calliope is the mother of Orpheus, the poem implicitly presents itself as Orphic, and Dante momentarily casts himself as an Orphic poet. The Orphic tradition seeks to overcome death through song. Yet this is not a belief Dante will ultimately sustain. He does not claim that poetry alone can grant immortality or conquer death, and he soon realizes that this will not be the foundation of his poetic project. The next scene establishes a markedly different tone for Purgatory. With morning and time now present, light also appears for the first time. This is not yet the dazzling spectacle of color that will dominate Paradise, where light radiates from the planets in varied hues, forming a richly rich, multicolored vision. In Purgatory, the world is more restrained, more human, and more natural. The sky appears with a gentle color of eastern sapphire, pure even at its highest circle, restoring delight to the pilgrim's eyes after the dead air of hell. Venus, the planet associated with love and appearing as the morning star, brightens the eastern sky, while the constellation of the fish fades from view. Turning to the right and gazing toward the opposite pole, the pilgrim sees 4 stars never seen except by the first human beings, Adam and Eve. The heavens seem to rejoice in their light, and the northern hemisphere, where ordinary human beings live, is described as bereft of this vision. In this way, Dante addresses his readers directly, reminding them of the loss incurred with the loss of Paradise. Another crucial detail emerges here. Dante turns to the right, a gesture that carries symbolic weight. Even in hell, while spiraling downward, he was in fact moving to the right, though he described it as moving left because he was inverted. Now he is upright again, and the proper orientation of the human world is restored. Dante carefully situates himself in space. The guiding metaphor is that of eastern light, and he continually orients and reorients himself by it. In Purgatory, as later in Paradise, he understands his position by looking toward the east. In doing so, Dante recovers a powerful image familiar to medieval thinkers such as Boethius and Cassiodorus, who held that true understanding in the West requires a turning toward the east. Orientation, both literal and intellectual, depends on seeking the source of light. At this stage, Dante merely gestures toward these broader implications, allowing them to resonate quietly beneath the surface of the narrative. Amid all of this, the shift in language between the opening paragraph and what follows is striking. There is a clear contrast between the excitement generated by the appearance of light and the deeper emotional tone of Easter Sunday. Dante understands the meaning of the resurrection, yet the mood is elegiac, focused on what has been lost in the widowed lands of the northern hemisphere. At the same time, the vision granted to him remains provisional, a temporary privilege rather than a permanent state. From this tension arises one of the defining poetic energies of Purgatorio. The pilgrim exists in an in-between condition, and the consequences of these tonal contrasts, initially subtle, will become increasingly evident as the Divine Comedy unfolds. After completing his descriptions, Dante encounters the first soul of Purgatory. Having turned his eyes away from the stars and shifted his gaze toward the opposite pole, where the constellation of the Wain had already vanished, he sees near him a solitary old man. His appearance commands such reverence that no son could owe greater respect to a father. His beard is long and white-streaked, matching his hair, which falls in 2 thick strands upon his chest. This figure is Cato. Dante presents him as aged, Roman, pagan, and a man devoted to law. His first words immediately raise the issue of transgression, questioning how Dante has fled the eternal prison against the flow of the dark stream, who has guided him, and what light led him out of the deep night that keeps the infernal valley in darkness. He asks whether the laws of the abyss have been broken, or whether some new decree in heaven has changed, allowing the damned to approach his shores. Cato speaks as a guardian of Roman legality. In this sense, he appears almost foreign to the logic of Purgatory, unable to grasp that Dante's presence might be the result of divine grace rather than any principle explained by natural or human law. It is Virgil, himself a Roman, who answers, He explains that he has already shown the pilgrim the guilty souls and now intends to guide him to those spirits who purify themselves under Cato's authority. The manner of their arrival, he says, would take too long to explain, but a power descending from above enables him to lead the pilgrim to see and hear Cato. He asks that their passage be approved, explaining that the pilgrim seeks freedom, a good so precious that those who truly understand it are willing to renounce life itself for its sake. This alludes directly to Cato, who, according to history, took his own life during the civil war rather than submit to either Pompey or Caesar, an episode recounted in the epic poem on civil war by Lucan. Virgil continues by reminding Cato that death for the sake of freedom was not bitter to him in Utica, where he left behind the body that will one day shine again. He insists that no eternal law has been violated, since the pilgrim is alive and Virgil himself is not bound by judgment. He adds that he comes from Limbo, where Cato's wife Marcia still dwells, and that she continues to look upon him with devotion. For her sake, Virgil asks Cato to allow them passage through his 7 realms and promises to carry word of his kindness to her. At this point, however, Cato remains unmoved, asserting that Marcia no longer has power over him. This encounter marks a remarkable opening to this section of the poem. The figure who greets the pilgrim on Easter Sunday is an old man, a pagan, and a suicide, all characteristics seemingly at odds with the Christian nature of Purgatorio. It is the day of renewed life, yet it begins with someone who knew nothing of the Incarnation. It is a realm of rebirth, yet it is introduced by a figure who chose death. Dante had already shown his judgment of suicides in Inferno, where such souls suffer harsh punishment, so the choice to begin Purgatorio with a pagan suicide is deeply puzzling. Traditionally, visions of the afterlife are ushered in by youthful figures who symbolize freshness, renewal, and beginnings. An aged man, and especially a suicide, would seem the least suitable guardian. The question, then, presses itself. Why does Dante choose precisely this figure to stand at the threshold of purgatory? The issue of suicide is perhaps the simplest to address, because Cato's death is a suicide undertaken for the sake of freedom, and purgatory is precisely the realm of freedom. Dante is beginning to outline both a political and a moral condition. It is political because Cato's act represents a rejection of the disorder and chaos produced by the civil war between Pompey and Caesar. It is also moral because Cato chooses to end his life in a sacrificial gesture, meant to draw attention to the way the state had been ruined by the rivalry of these two powerful figures. Freedom stands at the center of this vision, and Dante deliberately invites reflection on it in pagan intellectual terms from the very opening of Purgatorio. The middle canticle of the comedy concludes with the pilgrim's full recovery of free will, and the poem as a whole develops this idea through the example of Cato's relentless pursuit of freedom. Freedom is inseparable from the notion of the future. One cannot imagine freedom without some sense of beginnings and futurity, just as novelty is inconceivable without both freedom and an orientation toward what lies ahead. Even originality, including poetic originality, depends on the belief that things can be otherwise. If a person is enslaved to the past, to a political system, or to personal vices, however deeply internalized, freedom disappears. Cato represents someone who refuses to live under the tyranny of civil war and violence, conditions that make a moral life impossible. This also explains why he appears as an old man. Dante emphasizes that the search for the future does not reject the past, but grows out of it. Any sharp separation between past and future is denied. The seeds of what is to come already exist within what has been, embodied in a figure such as Cato. The third issue concerns Cato's pagan identity, which leads back to Dante's broader project in Purgatorio. Here a distinction must be drawn that Augustine, in the City of God, did not make. Augustine contrasts the earthly city with the heavenly city, the latter existing on earth only as a pilgrim community moving toward beatitude and union with God, while the former remains corrupt and largely incapable of participating in redemption. Even allowing for a flexible reading of Augustine, this division remains fundamentally dualistic. Dante, by contrast, positions himself against this strict dualism. Within nature itself, within the pagan, secular, and historical world, there are seeds capable of contributing to the formation of a renewed moral life, one that can ultimately harmonize with the Christian redemption he seeks to describe. The clearest sign of this tension, between time, freedom, the value of the pagan world, and the capacity of the secular to generate seeds for the future, appears when Virgil attempts to soften Cato's severity by invoking his wife. He appeals to personal ties, suggesting that he knows Marcia and will return to her, asking for passage as a kind of favor. This appeal relies on effective memory, yet Cato refuses it, unwilling to be shaped by the past. For him, sharp distinctions must be maintained, and Marcia can no longer influence his judgment. Moreover, the history of their relationship complicates the appeal. Marcia once left Cato to marry another man and later returned to him after that man's death, and Cato accepted her back. Dante recounts this episode elsewhere as evidence of Cato's extraordinary generosity. All of this background informs the encounter, but ultimately it underscores a deeper issue, the power of memory, and the limits beyond which memory can no longer determine the present or the future. After their brief exchange, Cato sets out the rules that must be observed in the work of cleansing. The stains of hell must be washed away, and the pilgrim must gird his loins. Dante follows these instructions with Virgil's help. When they reach a place where the dew still contends with the sun, sheltered from the wind so that it is not easily dispersed, Virgil gently spreads his hands upon the grass. Understanding his intention, Dante offers his tear-stained cheeks, and Virgil restores to them the color that hell had erased. They then move toward the deserted shore, a place whose waters have never carried a traveler who later returned. Once again, Dante is invoking a familiar contrast. Both Cato and Ulysses belong to the pagan world, yet they represent different paths within it. Ulysses embodies the transgressive pursuit of knowledge, while Cato stands for a disciplined and ethical response to the limits of human action. Before continuing, Dante must complete another ritual act. He must gird his loins, as a traveler in antiquity would do before setting out on a journey, whether in biblical tradition or in the Roman world. The act signifies self-restraint and readiness, a moment of inward containment. Yet something unexpected occurs when Virgil selects a plant to fashion the girdle. As soon as the humble reed is plucked from the ground, it immediately springs up again from the place where it was uprooted. The emphasis here lies on the natural world's capacity for renewal. The image clearly evokes the resurrection, but it remains entirely within nature. There is no direct intervention of grace. In contrast to what occurred in the forest of suicides in hell, the plant here is destined to rise again, to be reborn. The regenerative power of nature thus becomes a central theme of the canto. With the opening of the next canto, the situation shifts, though it begins once more with a search for orientation. Dante again turns toward the east, the Orient, which now more explicitly points to Jerusalem. Purgatory was believed to lie at the antipodes of Jerusalem, directly opposite the Holy City, which medieval thought regarded as the navel and center of the earth. From this extreme edge of the world, Jerusalem becomes an immediate point of reference. Dante reflects on movement while remaining still, noting that the sun has reached the horizon whose highest arc covers Jerusalem, while night rises from the opposite side of the world, accompanied by the signs of the heavens. Fixed in place, yet oriented toward the Holy City, he attempts to reconcile his hopes and expectations with the reality unfolding before him. Suddenly, a swift light appears, and a fast-moving vessel comes into view, carrying the souls of penitents toward the shores of Purgatory. This image stands in direct contrast to the boat of Charon in hell, which bore the damned. An angel of God arrives with a vessel, shining so brightly that Dante cannot bear to look directly at him. As the ship reaches land, Dante lowers his gaze and hears the many souls aboard singing a psalm, the song recalling the departure of Israel from Egypt. It is the psalm that commemorates the exodus from slavery toward freedom and the promised land. In this way, the earlier reference to Jerusalem binds the entire canto together. This psalm is the only biblical text quoted directly in the Divine Comedy. while scripture is constantly evoked. Only the Psalms and the Song of Songs are cited verbatim. This choice may acknowledge the poetic nature of the Psalms and Dante's responsiveness to their lyric form. Moreover, the Psalms offer one of the earliest expressions of subjectivity in Western tradition, tracing an inward exploration of desire, fear, passion, and moral struggle. The Pilgrim's Journey mirrors this inward search, and finally, the Psalms are lyrical reworkings of the story of Exodus. By invoking them, Dante suggests that the Divine Comedy itself is a lyrical retelling of that biblical narrative, and that his own human history participates in the same movement from bondage toward freedom. In the opening canto of Purgatorio, a vision of Roman political and moral freedom is presented, but the poem now broadens this perspective to suggest that all of history is involved in an exodus, a collective movement toward liberty. Dante thus brings together two traditions of freedom, a Roman one and a Jewish one, and seeks to connect them. He recognizes in both a foundational search for liberty, though each expresses it differently, and he attempts to harmonize their distinct ideas of beginnings by examining them in depth. The story of Exodus, in particular, embodies and clarifies the central intellectual concerns of purgatory. It tells of leaving the house of bondage while carrying away the gold of the Egyptians, a symbol of secular knowledge. That knowledge, too, must accompany the journey toward freedom. At the same time, the Israelites remain in the desert for 40 days, believing themselves abandoned by Moses while he ascends to receive the law. In their sense of abandonment, they turn to idolatry. Exodus thus recounts the experience of a people suspended between idolatry and revelation, between longing and promise. The act of making the golden calf expresses nostalgia, a desperate desire for the security they associate with Egypt, even though it was a place of slavery. Safety, or the illusion of it, becomes preferable to freedom when freedom appears uncertain. These are precisely the anxieties that occupy Dante as he enters Purgatory. Purgatorio as a whole becomes a space in which the pilgrim continually looks backward and forward, as past and future struggle for control of his mind. The poem moves away from large historical reflections on how the pagan world conceives of beginnings and new departures grounded in freedom, and the focus turns inward. The narrative becomes internalized. The pilgrim turns into himself and admits that he does not know where he is. This confession points to his condition of exile. He literally does not know which way to go. His mind and body are divided, and this inner dislocation persists. The penitent souls are equally lost, and they naturally ask him for guidance, yet they are all in a desert, a place defined by the absence of direction. Symbolically, the desert represents the unmapped space between Egypt and Jerusalem, an in-between region without routes or established paths. There are no signs or markers to follow, and so they ask Dante for directions. Virgil answers honestly, explaining that they are mistaken, since he and Dante are also strangers in purgatory. This is what exile means, and it is also what it means to write a poetry of exile. Purgatory is a desert, shaped by a spirituality of wandering and displacement. Dante suggests that human beings never fully belong anywhere, but are always in motion, always heading elsewhere. At the core of his religious longing lies a sense of pilgrimage, a recognition that the heart is not yet where it should be. Virgil continues by explaining that they too are lost, but Dante's living condition soon becomes evident. He tells the souls that he and his guide arrived only a short while before by a different path, so harsh and difficult that the present ascent will seem almost playful by comparison. When the souls realize from his breathing that he is alive, they grow pale with amazement. Like a crowd pressing around a messenger carrying an olive branch, eager for news and unafraid of trampling one another, these fortunate souls fix their gaze upon his face, forgetting for the moment their own need for purification. In this way, Dante himself becomes a source of temptation for them. They are meant to continue their ascent, yet they pause and linger. Their hesitation reveals another dimension of forgetfulness, and another way of understanding the difficulty of keeping one's destination firmly in view. One shade in particular steps forward and tries to embrace Dante. 3 times the attempt is made, and 3 times it fails. This repeated failure draws attention to the fact that the souls lack physical substance and cannot be grasped, a detail that will recur at several points in Purgatorio. The soul asks Dante to pause, and recognition follows. It is Casella, a friend from Dante's youth, a musician who may once have set Dante's poems to music, a man from Siena who has clearly died. The encounter softens the severity of the journey. It offers a moment of respite, a meeting with a friend, almost a pastoral interlude that interrupts the harshness of the desert and the weight of its symbolism. This pause allows for reflection and provides an essential aesthetic relief. Casella asks why Dante is undertaking this journey. The pilgrim answers that he travels in order to return to the place where he now finds himself, and then asks why Casella was delayed for so long. Casella explains the circumstances of his arrival in Purgatory. Once the questions are settled, Dante makes a significant request that reveals both the power and the limits of art. He asks Casella to sing one of the songs of love that once calmed his desires, in the hope that it might now bring some comfort to his weary soul, burdened by its living body. Casella agrees and begins to sing a poem written by Dante himself, setting it to music as he may have done in life. With this song, Dante creates an aesthetic enclosure. Casella sings with such sweetness that the sound continues to resonate within the listener. Sweetness here refers to musical harmony, though it also carries the connotation of taste and savouring that will later appear in the canto of the gluttons. Dante, Virgil, and the gathered souls are all absorbed in the sweetness of the music, held in rapture. Yet the poem being sung is Dante's own. The poet listens to himself, and a subtle narcissistic temptation emerges. He senses that Casella is affirming his identity, reassuring him that he is known and recognized. The danger of this pleasure quickly becomes evident. Everyone forgets the ascent. At this point, Cato appears, embodying the ethical voice and the authority of law. The venerable old man rebukes them, calling them negligent spirits and urging them to hurry to the mountain, to strip away what prevents God from being revealed to them. A clear conflict emerges between aesthetics and ethics. Dante has momentarily forgotten the lesson learned earlier in his encounter with Cato. Cato's anger is the anger of a teacher who has already explained the problem and now finds it repeated. Virgil had once hoped that Cato might be moved by memory, but Cato had rejected the claims of affection, pleasure, and the past. In this canto, Dante is thus caught in an idolatrous moment. He encounters something he himself has made, something he has shaped and composed, and he becomes so absorbed by it that it distracts him from his own ascent. He forgets why he is in Purgatory at all. For this reason, Purgatorio opens with a strong insistence on the necessity of new beginnings and new departures. Cato names the failing at stake as negligence. Negligence means a refusal to choose, and Cato's reproach points to the way poetry can create a state of suspension, a moment in which choice is deferred or neutralized. His ethics insist that human beings are always engaged in choosing. He speaks from the perspective of freedom, aware that literature and poetry possess the power, even if briefly, to soften and suspend that freedom. In a single word, Dante reveals an extraordinary level of self-awareness and self-reflection, a defining feature of the second canticle. Because Purgatory is a place of moral purification, Dante urges the souls who had gathered around Casella's song to disperse. The language he uses evokes scattering, like doves or pigeons spreading across the plain. Looking back, what becomes clear is Dante's persistent concern with communal destiny. Yet here that sense of community appears fractured. Cato's life was shattered by the civil war between Pompey and Caesar, leading him to suicide. Casella's song creates a temporary community that distracts all who hear it from their purpose. In both cases, Cato intervenes and breaks apart an illusory unity. What emerges is a deeper insight. Even defeat holds value. These moments of loss contain seeds that will be essential for rethinking how a shared historical destiny might be renewed and reconstructed. There is meaning, and even promise, within failure itself. The focus here is on a Dante oriented toward the future, a Dante who reflects on hope. Everything else matters only insofar as it belongs to the future, even when it appears to be past, since what is past was once itself the future, the only real dimension of time. In Purgatorio, Dante comes to understand that time moves in a single direction, toward what is to come, even though that movement ultimately turns out to be a return to the Garden of Eden. In Canto 5, however, Dante encounters souls who bring the power of looking backward sharply into view. These are souls who repent at the very last moment of life. Once again, the issue is time, but a form of time that proves almost inexhaustible. There is always the possibility of turning back, reflecting, and redirecting one's life. Among these souls is one who identifies himself as Buoncamp de Montefeltro, the son of Guido, previously encountered in Canto 27 of Inferno. Buoncamp embodies a rupture between past and future, since a child represents a project aimed forward in time. The father ends in hell, while the son finds himself on a ledge of purgatory, moving toward redemption. This contrast undermines any notion of an unbroken chain of necessity linking past, present, and future. What emerges instead is an emphasis on freedom. Once that bond of inevitability is broken, the idea is open that individuals are free to shape themselves, regardless of what precedes them. Buoncamp addresses Dante with a wish that the desire drawing him up the lofty mountain may be fulfilled, situating the scene within Dante's universe of desire, driven by longing. He asks Dante to show compassionate concern for him and then declares, "I was of Montefeltro, I am Buoncamp." The shift in verb tenses is striking. As in the canto of Ugolino, the soul asserts his identity in the present tense while distancing himself from his family history through the past tense. Dante asks what force led him astray from Campaldino, so that his burial place was never known, and invites him to recount his story. What follows is an extraordinary episode with deep autobiographical resonance, since Dante himself fought at the Battle of Campaldino. That battle marked a moment of personal maturation, his entry into the realities of life and conflict, and it enabled him, after the Florentine victory, to assert claims about his own identity, lineage, and political future. Here, however, he encounters not a victor but a victim. Some have speculated, with little evidence, that Buoncamp might even have been someone Dante killed in battle, whom he restores in poetry because he cannot do so in reality. Regardless of such claims, the episode remains a painful autobiographical moment, in which war appears as both inflicted and endured violence. Instead of describing the battle itself, Buoncamp recounts his death. Although the poem often concerns births and the far-reaching implications of being born, the changes each life brings into the world, here the focus shifts to death. Buoncamp describes how at the foot of the Casentino, a stream called the Archiano flows from the Apennines above the hermitage. Wounded in the throat, fleeing on foot and staining the plain with blood, he reaches the place where the river loses its name. There he loses sight and speech, ends with the name of Mary on his lips, and falls, leaving his body behind. He asks Dante to tell the living the truth of what happened. An angel of God takes his soul, while a demon cries out in protest, asking why one from heaven steals him away. This passage clarifies the power of time and of retrospection, the act of looking back upon the final moment of life. That moment becomes decisive, granting coherence and meaning to an entire existence. Human beings are born with expectations and possibilities, but it is death that ultimately reveals and gathers the meaning of a life into focus. After this exchange, the canto closes with 6 remarkable lines that may even contain a discreet echo of Dante's own marital history. The scene introduces Pia de Tolomei, a woman from Siena, and the brief encounter deliberately recalls Francesca in Canto 5 of Inferno, the canto that stands in symmetry with this one in Purgatorio. A new soul approaches Dante and makes a simple request, asking him, once he has returned to the world and rested from his long journey, to remember her, naming herself as Pia. These lines serve as a kind of epitaph. Pia, who suffered mistreatment at the hands of her husband, speaks without bitterness and with extraordinary forgiveness. The passage ends suggestively with the word meaning gem, which corresponds to the name of Dante's wife. This invites the thought that Pia may also evoke Dante's own longing that the wife he left behind in exile might one day forgive him. In any case, the episode introduces forgiveness as a radical category, since any true new beginning demands forgiveness. Canto 5 thus becomes a canto marked by deep pathos and intimacy, one in which Dante is profoundly involved with the souls he meets. Canto 6, by contrast, shifts into a public and political register, much like Canto 6 of Inferno and Canto 6 of Paradiso. The comedy consistently works through symmetry, and here the pattern continues. While the sixth canto of Inferno focuses on the city of Florence, the sixth canto of Purgatorio turns its gaze to Italy as a whole, portraying its disorder, fragmentation, and internal conflict. Dante compares himself to the winner in a game of hazard. When such a game ends, the loser remains alone, brooding over his throws, while the crowd gathers around the winner. One person walks ahead of him, another tugs at him from behind, another presses close at his side, each eager for attention. The winner listens to them all, stretching out his hand to one and then another, and in this way manages to move through the crowd. Dante likens his own situation to this scene, surrounded by penitents who, astonished to see him alive in the afterlife, press around him from every direction. He becomes the winner, while Virgil, largely ignored, resembles the loser. Through this image, Dante speaks of his salvation and the singular nature of his journey in terms of chance, almost as if it were the outcome of a game. Until now, the journey has appeared entirely providential, yet here it is described through the language of play and hazard. The metaphor resembles a lottery. Someone wins, someone loses. Dante implicitly acknowledges that, because he was born after the Incarnation, he has access to salvation, while Virgil does not. The language of play introduces an important theological tension. Salvation is no longer presented as the unfolding of a predetermined script, but as something involving risk. The relationship between the soul and God appears shaped by this element of risk, which paradoxically grounds human freedom. By invoking chance and hazard, Dante distances salvation from the idea that everything is already fixed by divine foreknowledge. In classical philosophy, especially in the thought of Boethius, the problem of human freedom and divine foreknowledge is addressed by placing God outside of time. All moments are present to God at once, while human beings experience time as a sequence, moving from past to future. From this perspective, although humans feel uncertainty about what lies ahead, their actions are already known to God. This scheme attempts to reconcile freedom and foreknowledge, yet it risks becoming illusory. Either human beings are free, or they are not. God's knowledge does not necessarily imply divine willing of every human act. Still, if God knows what humans do not, human freedom can seem weakened, reduced to something rhetorical rather than fully real. Dante approaches the question differently, marking a departure from Boethius. The relationship between God's foreknowledge and the soul's existence in time introduces the notion of chance and hazard, involving both God and the soul. Although he does not state it outright, the text gradually makes it clear that in the love relationship between God and the soul, there is always risk. In Dante's universe, which is governed by a principle of a love economy, hazard does not mean random casual chance, but a necessary element of risk. The cosmos is created through love, and every soul's engagement with God is rooted in love. Just as in the relationship between Beatrice and Dante, love entails risk. One may not be reciprocated, or the act of loving may expose one to pain or disappointment. God, in creating, risks being unloved, just as human beings experience risk in relationships. Dante admires figures such as Saint Francis, who prays on cliffs at night to dramatize that even prayer, like love, exposes one to uncertainty, vulnerability, and sometimes hurt. Later in Canto 6, the political dimension resumes with an encounter between two poets, Virgil and Sordello, the Mantuan poet. sharing the same birthplace across centuries, they immediately discuss Mantua. Dante plays with Virgil's famous epitaph in Naples, which notes that Mantua made him and Calabria took him away, and in a few lines recounts his life through his writings, the Aeneid, the Georgics, and the Eclogues. After this exchange, Virgil and Sordello attempt an embrace, symbolizing the reciprocity of affections across time. Yet, as spirits, the embrace is insubstantial, a failure reminiscent of Casella's attempted embrace in Canto II. This failure provokes Dante's impassioned political critique of Italy, awakening his civic conscience. Dante launches a harsh attack on his homeland. He calls it servile, a hostel of grief, a ship without a pilot in a great storm, not mistress of its provinces but a brothel. He laments that noble souls, eager to honor their fellow citizens, find the country consumed by war, with neighbors turning against one another even within the same walls. This grim vision inverts the earlier reciprocity seen between Virgil and Sordello. The interaction no longer affirms mutual regard but becomes destructive, a cycle of aggression against itself. A central theme here is the idea of community, which Dante simultaneously establishes and deconstructs. The Latin root of community, moenia, refers to walls, shared structures that organize and bind people together. In Dante's critique, these walls, rather than uniting, now separate citizens, underscoring the collapse of social cohesion. This motif recurs in his observations on the absence of law and the fragmentation of families, as with the Montagues and Capulets. Italy, in Dante's vision, is falling apart. Dante concludes his invective with a return to his birthplace, Florence, in the form of bitter satire. He ironically remarks that Florence may rejoice at this digression thanks to the resourcefulness of its people. While he speaks of Italy as a whole, the invocation of Florence brings the focus back to his own city and recalls Inferno 6. He calls this passage a digression, signaling that it steps outside the formal economy of the poem and speaks in his personal voice. Yet the irony is unmistakable. Florence is no better than the other cities he condemns, so the digression does not touch it. On another level, the statement emphasizes the impotence of poetic language to alter history or restore civic order. The poet's voice, Dante implies, is fundamentally ruptured from the political reality. He can call for improvement, but the invective itself acknowledges his powerlessness. He then turns to the first night of Purgatorio, describing the refuge he and Virgil take in the Valley of the Princes, a garden that recalls the Garden of Limbo in Canto 4 of Inferno. Dante introduces recurring motifs, natural beauty, precious stones, and the sense that even in a transitional realm like Purgatory, there is an enduring quality. At the same time, the pilgrim is touched by nostalgia for his hometown. The narrative is a pilgrimage of desire, desire for God, desire for Beatrice, and desire for the comfort of a lost home. The night is presented as dangerous, filled with phantasms of the past that threaten to disturb the judgment of the souls, including Dante himself. The movement to Canto 9 marks a transition to Purgatory proper, similar to the ruptures found in previous ninth cantos of the comedy, such as the failed encounter with Medusa in Inferno 9. Purgatorial purification is structured around the 7 deadly sins, arranged from spiritual sins, with pride as the root of all sin, to lust at the end. In each case, Dante first presents the opposite virtue. Humility precedes the punishment of pride, for example. This intellectual preparation allows the reader to comprehend the dynamics of good and evil, seeing what evil engenders by contrast to virtue. Purgatorio inverts the economy of Inferno. Rather than beginning with sin, it begins with virtue. The sequence resembles the medieval poetic form psychomachia, the battle of thoughts, as the poem unfolds through imagination, artful images, memories, and phantasms, a space between bodies and souls, reality and the mind. In approaching Canto 10, etymology clarifies the moral lesson. Pride, or superbia, denotes a flight from limitation, an attempt to transcend human bounds, to become superhuman. Humility, or humilta, derives from the ground, the earth, reflecting the human condition, being close to the earth, limited and mortal. Humility shares its root with the word human, from Latin homo, emphasizing that humans are earthbound, grounded, and ultimately return to the earth. Thus, the very notion of humility embodies the essential human condition, the opposite of the immoderate elevation implied by pride. Canto 10 opens with Dante observing the threshold of a gate, which the soul's wrong love disuses, making the crooked way seem straight, and he notices that it is already closed behind them. Purgatory, he understands, is a realm governed by variations on love. Sins arise when love is misdirected, excessive, or insufficient. These patterns are mapped onto the steep slopes of a mountain, which towers above a perilous abyss, a constant reminder to proceed with care. The pilgrim notes the scale of the landscape. The level terrace where they stop seems to him to measure only 3 human lengths from edge to the foot of the high bank, though it stretches as far as the eye can see in both directions. Here, the human body becomes the measure of creation, reflecting the canto's moral lesson. Pride is inordinate self-love, the belief that one alone can set the measure for others rather than being measured in turn. This mountain, with its carefully proportioned terraces, already signals that measurement, of the self, of virtue, of one's place in the world, will be a recurring metaphor in Purgatory. Along the cliffside, Dante notices sculptures depicting humility, examples of virtue expressed through art. These white marble images, he observes, would put to shame not only Polycletus but nature herself. The metaphor underscores divine measure and order, God as the supreme artist, whose work surpasses both nature, the mother of the arts, and the greatest human sculptors. The first of these sculptures is the angel Gabriel, a figure of humility who descends from on high to deliver God's message, in contrast to the prideful human who seeks to elevate himself above his station. Gabriel's stone figure is so lifelike that it seems to speak, repeating the angel's first words during the Annunciation. Ave, this moment, a narrative of descent, embodies humility and the ethical principle of lowering oneself in service to God. Mary also appears among the statues. She was imaged who turned the key to open the supreme love, her posture inscribed with the words, "Here is the handmaid of God." She embodies the ideal of humility, accepting her role as servant and model for those ascending the mountain. Dante, like the penitent souls, must learn humility, undergoing both ethical and aesthetic education. Art here serves as a medium of moral instruction, yet the lesson is complex. In the next canto, he encounters painters such as Giotto and Cimabue, who are proud of their achievements, and compares poets Guido Cavalcanti and Guido Ginizelli, noting that one surpassed the other in fame, while Dante imagines surpassing them both. This observation highlights that art can foster pride even as it teaches humility. The tension between virtue and artistic ambition becomes a central theme, showing that aesthetic beauty and moral education are deeply intertwined in Purgatory. In this section, Dante receives instruction on aesthetic perception from Virgil, a lesson in how to look that proves to be the most demanding task of an art student. Virgil advises, "Do not keep your mind on one part only," guiding Dante to move beyond a single focus and take in the totality of what he sees. The pilgrim's gaze is drawn first to Mary, a New Testament figure, and then to another scene carved into the rock, an Old Testament story of David dancing before the ark, and finally to an episode from Roman history, the Emperor Trajan. Here, Dante shows that the entirety of history, sacred and secular, can be read as an allegory of humility, a demonstration of God's artistic ordering of the world. In the Old Testament scene, David humbles himself through joyful dance, lifting his ephod before the ark. Surrounding him, incense smoke and the presence of divided choirs create a sensory tension. The eyes and nose register both affirmation and contradiction. David is depicted as both more and less than king, a phrase that highlights the indeterminacy of measure, a central concern of this canto. Opposite him sits Michael, observing from a palace window with vexation and scorn. She misunderstands David's humility as a loss of dignity, revealing how pride distorts perspective. The sin of pride arises not merely from aspiring to higher things, but from contempt for what is beneath oneself. Pride blinds the observer, setting self-perception against reality, as exemplified by Michael. The third scene Dante presents comes from secular Roman history, recounting the Emperor Trajan. A poor widow approaches him, grieving the death of her son, and Trajan, riding among a throng of horsemen with eagles in gold above, responds with measured justice. If he cannot act, his successor will. Dante emphasizes the emperor's humility in administering mercy and justice, demonstrating that the perfect ruler is one who descends from his high station to respond to the small and needy. Through these three episodes, Mary, David, and Trajan, Dante combines ethical and aesthetic education. The pilgrim is taught to perceive both art and history as ordered expressions of virtue, particularly humility, while also recognizing the dangers of pride. The lessons are intertwined. Art embodies moral truth, history exemplifies ethical conduct, and both serve as mirrors for human reflection on virtue and perspective. Dante has absorbed the meaning of these images, yet their effect stirs a moment of drama. While I was taking delight, he explains, in gazing on the images of humility so great, a deliberate oxymoron, and for their craftsman's sake precious to behold, lo, here are many people, murmured the poet, but they come with slow step, they will direct us on to the high stairs. Virgil prompts Dante to turn away from his admiration of God's art, but this guidance introduces tension. My eyes, which were content to behold novelties whereof they are fain, were not slow in turning towards him. Dante succumbs to the temptations of the eye, where pride of life, pride of the eyes, or curiosity, and pride of the heart converge. Yet instead of acknowledging his own weakness, he addresses the reader directly. But, reader, I would not have you turn from good resolution for hearing how God wills the debt shall be paid. Heed not the form. He urges attention to meaning rather than the peculiarities of form, preemptively defending against a superficial reading. Following Virgil's instructions, Dante observes the approaching figures but cannot recognize them. What I see moving towards us does not seem to me persons, but what it is I do not know, my sight wanders so. The contrast is striking. God's images had been clear and luminous, but now Dante hesitates to identify with human beings crushed beneath massive boulders, the punishment for pride, pressed to the earth. His aesthetic and ethical education seem challenged. He has no difficulty comprehending divine artistry, yet he resists aligning himself with those he perceives as beneath him, echoing Michael's refusal to acknowledge David from above. Gabriel's humility, Mary's acceptance, Trajan's justice, all are intelligible, but Dante struggles with human humility in suffering. Virgil clarifies that these bent and tormented figures are humans, like Dante. The pilgrim then addresses all Christians, proclaiming, O proud Christians, wretched and weary, who, sick in mental vision, put trust in backward steps, are you not aware that we are worms, born to form the angelic butterfly? The shift in pronouns is crucial. Dante begins with a superior stance, are you not aware, establishing himself as one who perceives the higher truth. Yet he immediately includes himself, we are worms, collapsing the distance between himself, other Christians, and readers. This double voice recurs throughout the text. Dante maintains a transcendent perspective, having witnessed the cosmos in its fullness, while simultaneously descending to participate in the shared human plight, bridging knowledge and compassion, insight and solidarity. This line also alludes to the ancient Roman practice of depicting butterflies on sarcophagi, because in Greek the word for butterfly is psyche, the same word used for the soul. The emblem signified that at death the soul would finally be able to fly toward the light and the Creator. In this apostrophe, Dante introduces the idea of metamorphosis. The soul is always in the process of shaping itself, both in life and in the penitential journey of purgatory. Dante concludes his introduction to the spirits of purgatory with an image that recalls the iconographic focus of the entire 10th canto. As for corbel to support a ceiling or a roof, sometimes a figure is seen to join the knees to the breast, which, unreal, begets real distress in one who sees it. So fashioned did I see these when I gave good heed. They were truly more or less contracted according as they had more and less upon their backs, and he who showed the most suffering in his looks seemed to say, weeping, I can no more. Here, Dante returns to a focus on form, despite earlier warnings to look beyond it. He describes caryatids, sculptural human figures appearing to support structures, emphasizing that form itself communicates meaning. Through this motif, Dante suggests that art is not only ornamental but also morally instructive. Form becomes a vehicle for understanding the moral world and the terms of human existence. This connection between ethics and aesthetics lies at the heart of Purgatory and recurs throughout the cantos. Dante presents examples of art, humility, his own mistakes, and moments of confused perception, showing how perspective shapes understanding. For Dante, perspective is both literal and spiritual. It reflects the position one occupies in the world, revealing truths unique to that vantage point, while also connecting to the inner self. How one perceives oneself and the measure of things can determine moral orientation. Michael's misperception, for instance, exemplifies how flawed perspective fosters pride, the primary sin and the spiritual root of all evils in these cantos. This is why Dante emphasizes perspective so strongly. It is central to his simultaneous aesthetic and ethical education in Purgatory, guiding the pilgrim to see and understand both the world and the self. Dante's difficulty in Canto 10 of Purgatorio arises from the fact that he begins as a spectator of works of art, which he seems to understand without difficulty. He observes what he calls visible speech, a synesthetic experience, God's art made manifest, whose meaning he readily grasps and enjoys. Yet he must move beyond observation. He must show compassion and recognize himself in the penitent souls burdened beneath enormous weights. At this stage, he cannot. He still needs to learn grief and how to connect emotionally to the images before him. This recalls St. Augustine in the Confessions, who describes the spectator's experience. The pleasure of the theatre, Augustine argues, comes from images of grief that do not truly touch us. Spectators are not expected to intervene for the suffering on stage. Augustine critiques the disengaged viewer and the limits of aesthetic experience. Dante builds on this insight, demonstrating that one cannot remain untouched by another's suffering. The very attempt to remain detached signals the overwhelming power of that experience. Through this, Dante begins to understand that no perspective is truly safe. He realizes that he resembles Michael in refusing to see the penitents as like himself, not yet acknowledging their shared humanity. These admissions indicate that his aesthetic education is beginning to take hold, a process further developed in Cantos 11 and 12. Canto 11 opens with the penitents reversing their perspective. Though still close to the ground, they now look upward, reciting the Lord's Prayer as Dante reshapes it. Our Father, who art in heaven, not circumscribed, but through the greater love thou hast for thy first works on high, praised be thy name and thy worth by every creature, as it is meet to render thanks to thy sweet effluence. May the peace of thy kingdom come to us, for we cannot reach it of ourselves, if it come not, for all our striving. As thine angels make sacrifice to thee of their will, singing Hosanna, so let men make of theirs. Give us this day our daily manna, without which he backward goes through this harsh desert who most labours to advance. And as we forgive every one the wrong we have suffered, even do thou in loving kindness pardon, and regard not our desert. In this version, God is emphasized as not limited by space, free, and present everywhere. Dante invokes the medieval notion of God as an infinite sphere, whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere, critiquing the inadequacy of human perspective. He also introduces a Neoplatonic element. The daily manna links Purgatory to the journey of exiles in the wilderness, echoing the Israelites between Egypt and Jerusalem. This metaphor frames Purgatory as a desert pilgrimage, where sustenance from God is essential for progress, emphasizing both spiritual dependence and the transformative journey of the soul. Dante's reversal of perspective in Purgatory reflects a new way of seeing, one that might be called a Franciscan perspective. From the very first line, "Praised be thy name and thy worth by every creature," there is an echo of St. Francis' Canticle of Creatures, the first poem in the Italian poetic tradition. That poem is a sequence of praises. Praised be thy name, praised be the water, and so on. Its purpose is to show that understanding creation requires looking from the bottom up rather than from above. Human beings are not the center of creation. They are valuable like everything else in the created world. This is the perspective Dante now begins to adopt. Humility, seeing from below and acknowledging the worth of all things. The canto also develops the connection between art and pride. Dante illustrates this by comparing painters and poets who surpass each other. Of Cimabue and Giotto, he writes that Cimabue once dominated painting, but now Giotto has taken the acclaim, leaving Cimabue's fame dim. Similarly, of the poets Guido Cavalcanti and Guido Guinizelli, Dante suggests that he himself may one day surpass them both. Fame, which the proud may seek, is shown to be fleeting and inconsistent, like the wind. Dante's moral understanding here is that pride involves attachment to transient human recognition, while humility sees beyond it. In Canto 12, Dante examines the punishments of the prideful, using a distinctive rhetorical artifice. Here the images are on the ground, so he must look down. Proud souls like Nimrod, Niobe, Saul, Arachne, and Sennacherib are depicted in their humiliation. He concludes the description with a tercet about Troy, illustrating its destruction and lowly state. These representations form a kind of visible speech. If the first letters of each tercet are read from top to bottom, they spell VOM, and with the Italian pronunciation, form the beginning of the word uomo, or man. This is a meditation on the fall of man. Dante's technique relies on the text itself. It cannot be grasped merely by hearing, demonstrating that God's art serves as a model for human art. This may seem like pride, celebrating one's own ingenuity, but Dante uses it to redefine ethical language. Loving what is above is not sinful. Pride becomes a sin only when it involves contempt for those considered beneath oneself. Through the world of art, moral language is re-examined, setting a precedent for Purgatory's moral and aesthetic lessons. In Canto 15, Dante moves to envy and contrasts it with charity, using light and reflection as his image. Because you still set your mind on earthly things, you gather darkness from true light. Light, though present, may fail to illuminate if one's perspective is limited. He continues, that infinite and ineffable good that is there above speeds to love as a ray of light comes to a bright body. So much it gives of itself as it finds of ardour, so that how far soever love extends, the more does the eternal goodness increase upon it. And the more souls there are that are enamoured thereabove, the more there are for loving well, and the more love is there, and like a mirror one reflects to the other. Here Dante draws on a Platonic image, reflecting ideas in the celestial hierarchy by Pseudo-Dionysius. Creation is like a hall of mirrors, with each part reflecting and refracting divine light. This reciprocity, light reflected between beings, illustrates how mercy and charity operate. Love grows and multiplies as it is mirrored among the souls, producing ever greater illumination of the eternal good. This image points to the generative principle of charity, the idea that charity produces more charity, that it has the power to generate and multiply itself. For Dante, this is the essence of mercy. Creation itself reflects light without diminishing the original source, a reflection he describes as the metaphysics of the mirror. The world, therefore, exists on the basis of mercy rather than envy, from which light cannot even be perceived. Charity allows for a God who creates freely, generously, without jealousy. Dante emphasizes this system of exchanges, this interconnectivity and reciprocity of all things, before moving to the central concerns of his text. In Canto 16, Dante encounters the magnanimous figure Marco Lombardo, who engages him in a discussion about human degradation and moral decay. The setting is a biblical cloud of anger, a world devoid of light and possessed by a kind of madness. Anger is understood as that which obstructs the clarity and illumination of reason. Virgil guides Dante through the gloom as a blind man follows a guide, ensuring he does not strike or injure himself. Amid this clouded world, which carries over from the blindness of envy, Dante hears a voice and asks if the world is truly so devoid of virtue and overflowing with iniquity, requesting that the cause be explained so he can understand it and reveal it to others. He wonders whether human actions are determined by external forces, such as the stars and planets, leaving no room for free choice, or whether they originate within ourselves. This is Dante's return to the long-standing debate about free will and God's foreknowledge that Boethius explored in The Consolation of Philosophy. Lombardo greets Dante as brother, the standard form of address among souls in purgatory, reflecting the human family motif introduced in the recast Lord's Prayer of Canto 11. Lombardo explains that the world is blind, yet Dante comes from it. Many attribute every cause to the heavens, as if celestial bodies determine all things. If this were true, free will would be null, and justice would be impossible, since neither reward nor punishment would make sense. Yet humans are given a light to discern good and evil, and free will, if exercised through initial struggles, can eventually prevail. While individuals are subject to greater powers and higher natures, they remain free in the exercise of their will. The distinction between choice and free will is crucial. Choice is an intellectual act, made through knowledge. Free will implies the capacity to act without external constraint to reach moments of authentic freedom. Theologians have long debated whether free will can coexist with prior knowledge of consequences, a tension Dante presents here. Lombardo also asserts that humans are simultaneously free and subject, a seeming contradiction that becomes clearer when Dante later turns to law, showing that within defined limits, freedom is exercised. This is the argument Lombardo presents. True freedom exists within structure, and within those limits, the will can act freely. Dante then gives a sense of creation by linking human freedom to the very act of the soul's origin. He writes that from the hands of God, who loves it before it exists, comes forth, like a playful child, the simple little soul, now weeping, now laughing, knowing nothing. This alludes to a famous Latin poem by the Emperor Hadrian about a small, wandering soul, and echoes St. Thomas Aquinas' view of the soul as originally simple, a tabula rasa. Dante reinterprets it not as a lost soul, but as a soul at play. Creation for Dante is playful, combining innocence with freedom. In play, one embodies spontaneity and liberty. This is the foundation of what may be called Dante's playful theology. God creates in an act of freedom, and that freedom becomes the basis for human freedom. Because humans are born free, their freedom is real, not compelled by necessity, affirming creation as spontaneous and ludic. From these theological reflections, Canto 16 moves into political and legal considerations. Dante links human freedom to political freedom. Rome, he says, which once made the world good, had two suns that illuminated both the road of the world and the road of God. Now the one quenches the other, and the sword is joined to the crook, so that both inevitably go wrong, for joined, neither fears the other. Dante is alluding to Genesis, which speaks of God giving humankind two luminaries, sun and moon, visible both by day and night. In medieval hierocratic thought, the sun represented the church and the moon the empire, emphasizing the church's superiority. Dante intentionally violates this hierarchy, calling them two suns to suggest that the church and empire, the institutions God provides to guide humans, are equal. By challenging the legal interpretations of canon lawyers at Bologna, Dante highlights how claims of freedom can coexist with obligations as subjects, continuing the argument of Canto 16. This sets the stage for Canto 17, the numerical center of the Divine Comedy. The canto opens with an apostrophe to the reader's memory. Recall, he asks, a time when a mountain mist limited vision, so that one could see only as moles do through their skin. As the dense vapors begin to lift, the sun's sphere enters faintly, and the mind recreates what is slowly revealed. Dante matches his steps to Virgil's and emerges from the fog into the weak rays of the setting sun. The scene is one of twilight, filled with reversals. The blind mole burrows below, while the alpine landscape obstructs sight above. Dante evokes both the highest heights and the lowest points of vision. The sun is setting, night approaches, and the solidity of the world seems to vanish. Yet Dante appeals to the reader's memory and imagination, suggesting that even when external vision fails, there remains an inner light, the capacity to see with the mind and the spirit, even in darkness. Dante prepares a remarkable second apostrophe, this one addressed to the imagination. Approaching the center of his poetic universe, he reminds the reader that this is a work of imagination. He asks, "O imagination, that do sometimes so snatch us from outward things that we give no heed, though 1,000 trumpets sound around us, who moves you if the sense affords you naught?" The question echoes earlier concerns. Where do our choices come from? Are we moved by an external power, or is action born from within? Here the question is framed in terms of imagination, a faculty that withdraws us from the outside world. Unlike Aristotle's triadic model, in which imagination translates sensory experience into images for rational judgment, Dante conceives imagination as independent of perception, a power to envision worlds that do not yet exist. As he approaches the center of his world, imagination is shown as a visionary faculty, encompassing reality while simultaneously transcending it. This duality will play a key role in Canto 17. Before exploring this further, Dante turns to the laws of purgatory. The realm is constructed and governed by love. At the center of the Divine Comedy, Virgil states that neither creator nor creature has ever existed without love, natural or intellectual. The natural love, he notes, is never in error. It is instinctual and beyond sin. What is subject to error is love of choice, which can be misdirected, excessive, or insufficient. This triadic division of love defines purgatory's topography. Every problem is a problem of love, and the realm's subdivisions reflect variations in how love is exercised. The deeper question concerns the love of choice. How is it determined? If perception shapes what we find desirable, where lies the fault when love is misdirected? Dante revisits the questions of will and responsibility raised in earlier cantos, now framed through love. Perception becomes central, for our view of what we love directly affects our moral accountability. Love, like imagination, is both rational and transgressive. It follows principles but exceeds strict rational control. At the center of the poem, Dante oscillates between two poles. On one hand is the real world, where responsibility for love and action is essential. On the other hand is the imagination, unconstrained by reality and free in its own domain. Suspended between these, Dante seeks a way to reconcile them. If imagination is free, how can one be accountable for actions in the real world? The resolution is subtle. Imagination does not negate reason. It surpasses it. Dante's poem is structured with precise principles of order, thematically concerned with ordering appetites and the will, yet the text acknowledges gaps and contradictions. These tensions, the interplay of love and imagination, responsibility and freedom, nourish the poem's complexity, enriching its beauty at its very core. Dante completes one stage in his journey towards self-knowledge and understanding of the world, and in Canto 18, he enters a different moral realm, aestia. Aestia, a Latin term, can be understood in English as despondency, indecisiveness, sluggishness, or sloth. It is, in a sense, a parody or inversion of contemplation, connected to a sense of disengagement from the world. It describes the condition of a mind indifferent to objects of desire, which have lost their appeal, consistency, and luster. This is the so-called noonday devil, the temptation experienced by monks in their cloisters when the idea of turning the mind toward the divine no longer holds attraction. It is a state of indifference toward anything outside oneself, both intellectual and dreamy in character. Canto 18 is the most intellectual canto in Purgatorio. Dante confronts theoretical questions that emerge from the wandering, unbounded imagination explored in Canto 17, which unsettle certainty about how the world is seen. The canto begins with Dante asking Virgil to clarify the theory of love introduced earlier. His vision has been sharpened, yet he seeks further understanding. Virgil responds by explaining a philosophical theory of perception. The mind receives impressions from outward reality and unfolds them internally, and love is simply the unfolding of such a perception. Virgil criticizes the view that all love is inherently good, attacking the Epicurean idea that every pleasure, regardless of its object, is praiseworthy. Moral judgment is required. Distinctions must be made between good and bad love. The impression may seem good, but not every imprint is virtuous, even if the wax on which it is impressed is. In this, Dante may be thinking of his friend Guido Cavalcanti, whose Epicurean leanings made pleasure the highest pursuit, a philosophy Dante ultimately rejects. Dante responds with confusion. If all is love, and the soul moves according to perceptions, how can merit be assigned for choosing rightly or wrongly? What seems good to one may not seem good to another, so the question shifts from imagination to perception. Virgil explains the scholastic view that humans naturally incline toward the good, yet retain the faculty of choice, the capacity to counsel and govern assent, free will once again. He acknowledges, however, that some aspects of free will are beyond his teaching and must be explained by Beatrice. Beatrice, for Dante, represents a visionary, transcendent form of love, not merely a mechanical or perceptual principle. Thus, Canto 18 extends and complicates the questions raised in Canto 17. Dante appears to move forward, yet the same impasse of perception, choice, and love resurfaces, demonstrating that moral and intellectual understanding in Purgatory is an ongoing, recursive journey. Dante now moves to translate the theoretical issues of love, imagination, and choice into a personal, existential dimension. This is accomplished through an erotic dream related at the beginning of Canto 19. Before entering the dream itself, Dante introduces it at the end of Canto 18. He describes how, after the shades had receded and were no longer visible, a new thought arose within him, spawning many others. Wandering among these thoughts, he closed his eyes and transformed his musing into a dream. This line establishes a close link between thinking and dreaming, with Dante privileging the latter at this moment. This emphasis is consistent with a broader literary tradition. The Romance of the Rose centers on a dream. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess is framed as a dream story, and the Vita Nuova is full of dreams. Later poets, such as Keats in Sleep and Poetry, similarly explore dreams as a source of knowledge that is not willed. Revelations arise within the mind independent of conscious effort. Medieval authors were acutely aware of this potential. Macrobius's commentary on the dream of Scipio, drawing on Cicero and Artemidorus, distinguishes between oracles, fantasies, insomnia, and delirium, showing that dreams were considered a serious medium of insight. Dante's specific dream, however, is rooted in the world of Aestia, reflecting the despondency and indifference previously explored. The dream provides a way to give the abstract theories of love, free will, and imagination a personal form, showing their importance for him individually. In the dream, at the hour when the day's heat, tempered by Earth and Saturn, can no longer warm the cold of the moon, Dante sees a woman in distress, stammering, with squinting eyes, crooked feet, maimed hands, and a sallow complexion. His gaze revives her, straightening her tongue and coloring her face as love demands. She begins to sing. She is the sweet siren, luring sailors to their ruin, as she once turned aside Ulysses. Before Dante can be fully ensnared, a holy and alert lady appears, confronting the siren. She seizes the temptress, exposing her in a manner that awakens Dante with the stench of corruption. Turning to Virgil, Dante is reminded of his guide's presence, who urges him to rise and continue, leading him toward the opening by which he may enter. In this way, the dream merges the theoretical and personal dimensions, allowing Dante to confront temptation, desire, and moral perception in a vivid, experiential form. It dramatizes the human engagement with love and free will, while keeping him under the guidance of reason, represented by Virgil. The dream takes place at dawn, a time traditionally considered prophetic. It functions as an allegory, since the act of rending a veil or tearing clothes suggests that something hidden lies beneath, a truth to be uncovered, rather than a mere fable. Dante invokes the planet Saturn, and his references to planets are always linked to the liberal arts. The moon to grammar, Mars, the planet of war, to music, Jupiter to justice, and Saturn to astronomy and contemplation. In this context, sloth appears as the obverse of contemplation, a parody of inward reflection that remains self-absorbed rather than reaching beyond oneself to a timeless space. Here, The movement is purely inward. Dante's use of astronomy and divination situates the dream in a rational yet symbolic framework, connecting the signs of the heavens to human understanding. Within the dreamer occupies a passive position. The dream arrives. It is not willed or chosen. The images and apparitions descend upon him without his control, creating a condition of passivity that mirrors sloth. Vigilance and conscious judgment are temporarily suspended, leaving him subject to forces beyond his immediate dominion. The dream presents two women, representing two modes of being and two paths of choice, recalling the myth of Hercules at the crossroads, where he must choose between vice and virtue. Unlike Hercules, who always chooses right and thus virtue, the presence of two women complicates the choice. Dante's language carefully distinguishes them. The first is effemina, a term emphasizing materiality and animalistic qualities, while the second is a donna, derived from domina, a holy and alert lady. The distinction makes the moral choice clearer. The first woman embodies an aesthetic of ugliness, in contrast to the usual association of beauty with love and pleasure. She appears stammering, with squinting eyes and crooked feet, an anti-Beatrice figure. Yet the dreamer, for the first time, becomes an active subject. His desires transform her, reshaping her image and investing it with attractiveness, as love animates perception. Ugliness is not static here. It undergoes metamorphosis, revealing the power of human desire to alter the world of appearances. The identity of the first woman remains unclear, yet her temptation is unmistakable. She seduces Dante through her song, presenting a poetic allure that represents a shallow, meretricious form of poetry. She invokes the myth of Ulysses, a figure who has long served as a source of fascination and caution for Dante. Ulysses embodies the idea that knowledge worth having is inseparable from transgression, and the siren suggests that Dante's own journey, though guided by divine providence, could follow the same path of boundary breaking. The temptation lies in imagining that pleasure and fulfillment can be attained simply by yielding to desire. Yet the promise is false. The siren claims to satisfy Dante completely, just as she supposedly did for Ulysses. In reality, Ulysses never lingered on the island of Capri, where she is said to dwell. He listened to her song only while bound to the mast, so she offered him no true pleasure. The siren's message blends transgression with constraint, suggesting immediate satisfaction while concealing danger and death. In contrast, another woman emerges, clearly the antagonist of the siren, and a figure who can be identified as Beatrice in later cantos. These two women represent two forms of poetry and two kinds of love. The siren's voice is sweet, false, and seductive, encouraging Dante to abandon his journey. Beatrice's voice is austere but truthful, insisting that the journey must continue. The siren promises pleasure but carries the stench of death, whereas Beatrice's guidance embodies the ongoing quest of love and the proper path of the poet. The distinction between these two voices provides an objective criterion: survival and the avoidance of death. The siren, despite her superficial sweetness, represents a mortal trap. Beatrice embodies life, progress, and the pursuit of higher truths. The encounter recalls the episode with Casella in Canto 2, where beauty and song seduce others to distraction. However, in this scene, Dante enters the deepest reaches of his unconscious, revealing an intimate self-awareness. Unlike Casella's public poetry, this is an internal confrontation with temptation, moral choice, and the demands of his own poetic and ethical vocation. Dante now moves into a segment of the poem where poetry itself becomes the central focus. He begins with a classical tradition, staging a critical encounter in the purgatorial realms of avarice and prodigality between Statius and Virgil. Statius considers himself a disciple of Virgil, yet he also challenges Virgil's thought. Virgil presents Aeneas, a hero deeply divided within himself who nevertheless manages to navigate his path, albeit through a zigzagging and often erratic journey. Statius, in contrast, emphasizes the monstrous and nightmarish dimensions of human existence in the Thebaid, merging tragedy with epic and creating one of the most psychological of classical epics, focused on the wars of the mind and the horror of human desires and fate. Dante seeks to bring these two worlds together in what can be called a little epic, a lyrical transcription that harmonizes two epic texts. This is a formidable task, as it requires showing that Virgil and Statius, separated by decades, Virgil dying in the year 19 and Statius living around 70 AD, can converse across time through poetry. Statius can be read as a classical version of Dante himself. Both are disciples of Virgil, and Dante aims to unite them. The challenge is not merely reconciling thematic differences. While Statius is skeptical of the empire, Virgil largely endorses it, celebrating Augustus and imperial ideology in the Aeneid. These differences can be bridged. The deeper difficulty lies in adjusting Statius's vision of monstrosity to a sacred perspective. How can something sacred be discerned in the texts of Statius? Can the chaos of heroes entangled in their fantasies and enslaved to fate yield anything good? Dante must grapple with this gulf between the two worldviews, seeking a convergence of the tragic and the sacred. Canto 21 begins with an allusion to humanity's natural thirst for knowledge, evoking the Aristotelian concerns of the Convivio. Statius then appears, and the natural world responds. The mountain trembles, marking the liberation of a soul through expiation. Every time a soul completes this purgatorial purification, the earth quakes. In this instance, Statius, who has endured over 500 years of suffering, experiences a freedom of volition and prepares to ascend to the Garden of Eden, prompting the mountain's tremor and the praises of the purified spirits. Statius recounts his own story, beginning with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem when the Emperor Titus, with divine assistance, enacted justice for Judas's crimes. At that time, Statius was still a pagan, yet he later embraced Christianity. Drawn to Rome by desire, he wrote of Thebes and began a work on Achilles that remained unfinished. He explains the sources of his poetic inspiration, the divine flame that ignited his art, and above all, the Aeneid, which acted as both mother and nurse to his poetry. Without Virgil's example, he claims, he would have achieved little of enduring value. Had he lived during Virgil's lifetime, he would gladly have consented to one more day of life just to witness the poet in person. Two metaphors for poetry emerge here. The first is that of sparks, portraying poetry as capable of igniting a fire in its readers. The second metaphor is that of nourishment, of poetry as a mother and nurse feeding an inner hunger. This latter image expresses profound acknowledgement of a master, though Statius does not yet know that it is Virgil to whom he speaks. When Dante finally reveals Virgil's identity, the two attempt to embrace, but Virgil quickly interrupts the gesture. "Brother, do not so, for you are a shade, and a shade you see." And he, rising, "Now you may comprehend the measure of the love that burns in me for you, when I forget our emptiness and treat shades as solid things." This moment highlights a recurring error, one meant to convey the illusions poets may hold, imagining a solidity in themselves rather than only in their works. In truth, there is no such solidity. Distance and emptiness lie between poets and their creations. Perhaps for this reason, works of art become the central focus of Canto 22. The two poets begin to converse, and Virgil asks Statius to explain the moral failing in him, the sin of avarice. "Wherefore, from the hour when Juvenal descended among us in the limbo of hell, and made your affection known to me, my goodwill toward you has been such as never yet did bind to an unseen person, so that these stairs will now seem short to me. But tell me, and as a friend pardon me if too great confidence slackens my rein, and talk with me now as with a friend. How could avarice find place in your breast, amid wisdom so great as that wherewith you were filled by your zeal?" This passage is significant on multiple levels. First, it asserts a bond of friendship between Virgil and Statius. Friendship, in Aristotle's Ethics and in Cicero's treatise on friendship, represents an ethical virtue intertwined with love of truth, a quality Dante equates with philosophy itself in the Convivio. Yet there is rhetorical exaggeration here. Friendship presupposes some equality, but Statius, as disciple, views Virgil as poetically superior, while from a theological perspective, Statius is the superior figure, destined for paradise while Virgil must return to limbo. Virgil's invocation of friendship thus gestures toward wishful thinking. It is also notable that Dante is aware friendship was never truly considered a Christian virtue. It originates in the classical and pagan tradition, grounded in the earthly notion that a friend participates in one's soul. In Christian thought, such friendships could distract from higher, paradisiacal aspirations and spiritual ecstasies. Dante recognizes that attempts had been made to reconcile or Christianize the classical notion of friendship, yet he presents it here with both its earthly power and its limitations. The conversation between the two souls brings them back to earth, as if they were genuine friends meeting in a public space, casually discussing their moral failings and their poetic crafts. The central question remains: how could Statius have been so avaricious when he is enlightened in so many other ways? Statius responds that he was not truly avaricious, but prodigal. In this distinction, prodigality involves devaluing and dispersing goods, while avarice is an overvaluation and accumulation of them. He defends this understanding of his sin at length before recounting his moral conversion, demonstrating the transformative power of poetry. He explains that avarice was too distant from him, but a lack of moderation had punished him for thousands of cycles of the moon. Only by heeding certain lines in the Aeneid, where Virgil seemingly rebukes human greed, did he find guidance and correction. Statius illustrates how he read a passage in Book 3 of the Aeneid, the story of Polydorus, who was killed for his gold, and how it moved him to moral awareness. This reading exemplifies how individuals interpret texts selectively, extracting passages that resonate with their own experience. In Statius's case, he alters the meaning of Virgil's text, turning what may have been ambiguous into a moral lesson. The word used in the original text can signify both sacred and cursed, linking holiness and profaneness, and demonstrating how poetry can exert moral power independently of the poet's intentions. This explains why Dante repeatedly distinguishes between authors and their works. Texts can be read, interpreted, and adapted to instruct or inspire regardless of original intent. Virgil then questions Statius's poetic and spiritual development. Dante deliberately highlights Virgil as the author of the eclogues, pastoral poems where rivalries are depicted but never tragically resolved. Pastoral poetry deals with tension and competition between shepherds, yet outcomes remain non-fatal. This contrasts with the moral weight of Statius's personal journey. Virgil asks, in effect, about the relationship between poetry and faith. How did Statius find the path to belief after his conversion? Statius replies that it was Virgil who first guided him toward Parnassus, the symbolic mountain of poetry, enabling him to drink in its caves, a metaphor for the thirst for knowledge introduced earlier. Virgil illuminated the path to God, like one carrying a light at night, not for oneself, but to benefit those who follow. Statius recalls Virgil's prophecy of renewal. The ages are restored, justice returns, and a new progeny descends from heaven. This references Virgil's fourth eclogue, celebrating the birth of Pollio, and embodies a Pythagorean vision of the world's cycles, the Golden Age, Silver Age, and so forth, in a continual rhythm of decay and renewal. For Virgil, birth itself carries the potential to restore and rejuvenate the world, a principle that deeply resonates with Statius's own poetic and spiritual awakening. Statius then explains how the world outside reinforced the message of faith he had discovered in Virgil's fourth eclogue. This eclogue is understood as a messianic poem, a bridge from poetry to faith. Statius declares to Virgil, "Through you I was a poet, through you a Christian." This line is significant and merits careful attention. It employs an anaphora, through you, which underscores the continuity from poetry to faith. Yet the line also contains a caesura, a pause in the middle, which suggests a break between the two experiences. The movement implies a transition from poetry to faith, but technically it separates the two realms. One cannot pass seamlessly from poetry to faith, though one can move from one poetic experience to another. This tension, the dual power and ambiguity of poetry, is precisely what Dante seeks to capture. The differences between Virgil and Statius are largely mediated by the connections in their poetry, yet an unbridgeable divide persists. Statius confronts the tragedy inherent in birth, whereas Virgil treats birth with optimism, emphasizing its role in shaping history. Virgil's approach reflects a desire to define the sacred, while Statius comes to understand the sacred by heeding Virgil's guidance, a lesson Virgil himself could not fully enact. Thus, their poetry carries the ambiguous meaning of sacred, encompassing both the profane and the holy. This hybridity allows Dante to integrate Statius's complex, sometimes contradictory vision into his own understanding of history and the sacred. In this way, Dante's poetry demonstrates, through its very form, the power and ambiguity inherent in poetic expression. The encounter with Dante's friend Felice Donati among the gluttonous sinners in Canto 23 marks a turning point in the literary segment that had begun with the recognition of Virgil and Statius. Poetry remains central, but Dante sets aside the classical framework of literary history. While Virgil's model of the generosity of poetry continues to serve as a standard, the focus shifts to Dante's own role in contemporary poetic history, taking on an autobiographical tone. The moral terrain of Purgatorio 24, framed by the expiation of gluttony, allows both sin and its ascetic punishment to illuminate the poetic dialogue that Dante stages with Bonagiunta de Luca, a poet of an earlier generation. The conversation with Felice Donati, brother to Piccardo Donati and related to Dante's wife, Gemma, carries the memory of violent and satirical sonnets they had exchanged in life. Now the tone is reconciliatory. Past follies are set aside, and this urbane manner anticipates the more intense encounter with Bonagiunta. The discussion moves from the virtues of a woman who had aided Dante Gentucca to pressing questions about Dante's identity, the originality of his poetic style, and his framing of the poetic school called the Dolce Stil Novo, or Sweet New Style, through Bonagiunta's perspective. Bonagiunta asks, "But tell me if I see here him who brought forth the new rhymes, beginning, 'Ladies that have intelligence of love'?" Dante replies that he is one who, when love inspires me, takes note, and sets it forth in the manner he dictates within me. Bonagiunta responds, "O brother, now I see the knot that kept the notary, and Gittone, and me, short of the sweet new style that I hear. Clearly I see how your pens follow close after him who dictates, which certainly befell not with ours, and he who seeks farther can see no other difference between the one style and the other. Satisfied, he falls silent." This passage resonates with long-standing debates and critical controversies. Bonagiunta tests Dante's claims about his innovation by quoting the opening line of Dante's song from the Vita Nuova, "Ladies that have intelligence of love." In the Vita Nuova, Dante presents the poem as a radical shift in his understanding of love and poetry, recounting how the words came to him spontaneously while walking along the banks of the Arno. The conceptual force of the song is polemical. Guido Cavalcanti, in one of his most famous lyrical philosophical reflections on love, had argued that love and knowledge are disconnected. Love arises not from intellect, but from a violent force that clouds and shatters the mind. Dante's song, referenced by Bonagiunta, challenges this tradition. By invoking a circle of women, the ladies who have the intellect of love, Dante establishes an audience capable of apprehending the intellectual essence of love, asserting that love and reason can coexist. His position maintains that passion can become virtuous, and that the rhetoric of praise, a mode resonant with religious laudes, defines the distinctiveness of the new amorous discourse developed in the Vita Nuova. In another work, De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante distances himself polemically from Bonagiunta and other Tuscan poets by critiquing their style, which he understands as a perspective, a way of seeing the world. The style of the earlier generation, to which Bonagiunta belongs, is narrow and municipal, relying on prefabricated, abstract technical language drawn from the scholastics. This approach misses the radical openness of poetic language that Dante, along with Guido Guinizelli and Guido Cavalcanti, enacts. The contrast between the old style and the new raises Dante's historical consciousness. He recognizes that he and the Guidos inhabit a modern world, even if elsewhere he associates modernity with the transitoriness of time and precariousness. The gap between Bonagianta's poetic values and Dante's own is thus rooted in the new poetry Dante and Ginizelli practice, the poetry of this sweet new style. The adjectives are significant. Sweet evokes dulcedo, referring to the musical quality of the lyrical language, and in the context of gluttony, associated with the tavern songs of Goliardic poets celebrating banquets, dice, and women, it also suggests a refinement of taste. New conveys freshness, youth, and modernity, positioning Bonagianta, Gittone, and the Sicilian poets, such as the Notary, as attached to past and unchanging modes of composition. The true sense of Dante's poetic novelty emerges in his self-description. I am one who, when love inspires me, takes note, and sets it forth after the fashion which he dictates within me. In this account, Dante submits to the authority of the him who dictates, the inner voice of love as absolute master. Love governs the mind of the poet as a supreme inner authority. The poet portrays himself as a scribe. He takes notes, recording what is dictated. The verb note echoes the title of the Sicilian poet Jacopo da Lentini, called the Notary, who served as a scrivener at the court of Frederick II, drafting legal documents and administering oaths. Dante's metaphor of noting emphasizes poetry as the enactment of the law of love, a new code replacing the Provençal and Sicilian traditions. This claim must be understood within contemporary literary history, forming a modern poetic tradition parallel to the classical lineage of Virgil and Statius in Cantos 21 and 22. In Purgatorio 26, Dante meets Guido Ginizelli, his poetic father, who in turn points to the great Provençal poet Arnaut Daniel, foregrounding questions about the new tradition. The poets in this canto are sinners of lust, raising the traditional theme of poetry and desire. The encounter with Ginizelli recalls earlier cantos, such as Francesca in Inferno 5 and the first canto of the Sodomites, though the sin of Ginizelli lacks the tragic finality seen in Brunetto's punishment. Before considering Dante's meeting with Ginizelli, attention must be given to Purgatorio 25. Though it appears as a digression from the poetic rhetoric of surrounding cantos, it raises highly general intellectual issues that illuminate debates in Purgatorio 24 and 26. It presents a technical, doctrinal exposition on the ontological status of the shades. The literary cantos from 21 to 26 explore problems of hermeneutics, the hidden sense of Virgil's texts, the violence of interpretation, authorial intention, and literary modernity. In Purgatorio 25, Statius explains to Dante how shades without bodies can experience punishment, arguing that their suffering arises from their aerial bodies. To support this, he delivers a sophisticated lecture linking bodies and souls, embryology, and theology. He begins by rejecting Averroë's doctrine of the separate existence of faculties, such as the possible intellect, and the notion of a metaphysical gap between the vegetative and sensitive powers of the soul. The soul, he asserts, is characterized by a threefold activity, and its creation is directed by the first mover. The prime mover turns to it with joy over such art of nature, and breathes into it a new spirit filled with virtue, which absorbs the activity within it into its own substance, and forms a single soul that lives, feels, and revolves upon itself. God's action is described in this way to echo the spiration of love, involved in poetic creation as depicted in Purgatorio 24. In retrospect, the language used for the soul's creation mirrors Dante's analogy of his poetic practice to the divine economy of producing souls. Another connection links cantos 25 and 26. Statius provides an account of the soul's origin, tracing its development from the Father's seed to its incarnation, and ultimately situating its life within the eschatological framework of the resurrection. In Purgatorio 26, Dante transposes this doctrine of the soul's creation into a genetic metaphor for literary generation. The relationship between Dante and Ginizelli is expressed organically, in the terms of a father-son connection. I here name himself the father of me, and of others my betters, who ever used sweet and gracious rhymes of love. The literary theological coherence of this sequence, forming an extended literary segment in Purgatorio, does not, however, account for all aspects of Canto 26. As in parallel cantos 26 in Inferno and Paradiso, Dante raises the issue of language, particularly foreign languages. In Inferno 26, Ulysses' rhetorical performance is conducted in Greek with Virgil. In Paradiso 26, Dante meets Adam, and their conversation centers on Hebrew and the variations in the names of God. In Purgatorio 26, Arnaut Daniel, the Provençal love poet admired for his sestina in De Vulgari Eloquentia, speaks using Dante's tercets but in his native Provençal. In this way, poetry emerges as an imaginative realm of intimacy, in which, much like limbo, different eras and voices are intertwined. At the same time, however, the poetic experience across these 6 cantos evokes a heterogeneous space in which the unbound and unbindable resist the bonds of influence and affection. The ambiguous light of these cantos carries the pilgrim and the 2 poets flanking him, Statius and Virgil, to the threshold of the Garden of Eden, where Dante will confront both his personal history and the history of humanity, demanding an expansion of his theological vision. With Canto 26, the pilgrim's purgation is complete. He has moved through the stages of purgatory, from pride to lust. In Canto 27, he passes through a wall of fire, cleansing completely any residual stains on his soul, preparing to approach and enter the Garden of Eden. The canto concludes with Virgil's final words, marking the moment when the pilgrim must proceed morally on his own. Virgil says, "The temporal fire and the eternal you have seen, my son, and are come to a part where I of myself discern no farther onward." This statement signals the limits of Virgil's guidance. From this point forward, the structure of their relationship and the direction of the journey are reversed. Virgil continues, "Take henceforth your own pleasure for your guide." This extraordinary line emphasizes the poem as one of desire. What drives the pilgrim forward, what motivates his journey of self-discovery, is now desire itself. Pleasure becomes the guiding principle. The pilgrim can act according to his own inclinations. In this sense, it foreshadows the exercise of free will. The link between pleasure and happiness will be explored repeatedly in Paradiso. Dante then observes the natural delights near the earthly paradise, where vegetation flourishes spontaneously, a metaphor for the pilgrim's newfound ability to act and decide spontaneously. Virgil also recapitulates the earlier journey, from the wilderness to the garden. Dante is offered a choice. You may sit or go among them. He must decide whether to proceed to the Garden of Eden, a journey that is both forward and backward in time. The garden lies behind humanity, yet still ahead. The past is, in a sense, the future. Dante can choose to remain in the garden, embracing its beauty and complacency, or continue onward, becoming an anti-pastoral poet, one who questions arrival and seeks new departures. While Paradiso later confirms the latter path, for now Virgil simply presents the options. This moment resonates with the idea of felix culpa, the notion that the fall of man was fortunate, allowing humanity to transcend its previous state. The pilgrim may remain in the garden, assuming an Adam-like position, or surpass even that innocence. With this, Virgil's teaching concludes. He leaves Dante to his own will. Free, upright, and whole is your will, and it would be wrong not to act according to its pleasure. Wherefore I crown and mitre you over yourself. This marks the attainment of free will. Purgatory, in its entirety, moves between 2 poles, the liberty sought by Cato in the Libyan wilderness, and the free will that allows the pilgrim to recognize moral autonomy. A moral life is only possible when one understands oneself as free. Dante becomes fully responsible for his own actions. In effect, this moment constitutes a secular coronation. Virgil, as a lay priest, consecrates the pilgrim's self-mastery, transferring the authority to act freely to Dante himself, the poet, through the intermediary of his guide. Once the pilgrim comes under the guidance of Beatrice, particularly in Paradiso, aesthetics assumes a central role. At this stage, the focus is no longer ethical. Søren Kierkegaard, for example, says that life or knowledge progresses through stages, the aesthetic, then the ethical, and finally the theological. Dante, however, inverts this order. The aesthetic, often considered superficial or elementary, is presented as the point of greatest maturity. perception and enjoyment of the world precede ethical reflection. In Paradise, all concerns are intellectual. Moral problems no longer dominate. From Canto 28 to Canto 33, the conclusion of Purgatorio, the narrative enters a fragmentary space, a literary segment resembling a pastoral oasis. This space represents what classical literature calls a locus amenus, a beautiful, idealized spot where relaxation is possible. Dante had hinted at such spaces in limbo. He fuses this classical notion with the biblical hortus, or enclosed garden, as in the Song of Songs, and more clearly with the Garden of Eden. Unlike the conventional use of the trope, where the garden offers escape from the city and its historical pressures, Dante's locus amenus is never truly removed from history. The Garden of Eden is simultaneously a place of self-confrontation, intellectual reflection, and moments of intense, even terrifying, experience. This is apparent at the start of Canto 28. Eager now to search within and round about the divine forest green and dense, which tempered the new day to my eyes, without waiting longer I left the bank, taking the level ground very slowly over the soil that everywhere gives forth fragrance. A sweet breeze that had no variation in itself was striking on my brow with the force only of a gentle wind, by which the fluttering boughs all bent freely toward the quarter where the holy mountain casts its first shadow. Yet were they not so deflected from their upright state that the little birds among the tops ceased practicing all their arts, but singing they greeted the morning hours with full joy among the leaves, which kept such burden to their rhymes as gathers from branch to branch. Through the pine forest on Chiassi's shore when Aeolus lets forth Sirocco. Here, Dante displays the richness of the pastoral tradition. Fragrance, running water, deep shade, birds singing as if in dialogue with humans, a plenitude of natural order and innocence. Yet the scene is not entirely unblemished. Though the pilgrim has passed through the wall of fire to purify himself, he is not a new Adam. He still carries the stains of experience and history, and desire remains active within him. An autobiographical element further nuances this imperfect pastoral vision. Dante imagines the Garden of Eden as the pine woods near Ravenna, where he once walked mornings on the way to the sea. For him, this garden blends the ordinary with the sublime, merging lived experience with the heights of imaginative vision. The next lines in the garden provoke a shock of recognition. Dante writes, "Now my slow steps had carried me on into the ancient wood so far that I could not see back to where I had entered it, when lo, a stream took for me further progress, which with its little waves was bending leftwards the grass that grew on its bank." These lines clearly recall the opening of Inferno. The Garden of Eden is another version of the wilderness previously traversed, seen now from a different perspective. The supernatural world is revealed as the natural world seen through a transformed lens. Unlike the opening of Inferno, however, this is no shipwreck. The mountain has been climbed, and a new departure awaits. Dante asserts himself as an anti-pastoral poet, rejecting the seductive temptations of gardens, premature halting, and self-enclosure in luxurious fantasy. Yet something, or rather someone, halts him. Her name is Matilda, a woman dancing, singing, and gathering flowers, who embodies an aesthetic fascination for him. In this moment, Dante engages with a form of traditional Provençal poetry called the pastorelle. In a pastorelle, a knight enters a meadow or forest, encounters a shepherdess, dismounts, and woos her. The poem often ends with a playful pun on the promises of paradisiacal ecstasy, making it a subtle erotic song. Dante draws on this mode, used famously by his friend Guido Cavalcanti, but he distances himself from Cavalcanti's erotic violence. This is simply a scene of admiration and encounter, not seduction. Having just emerged from the circle of lust, Dante has cleansed himself, yet traces of his history, body, and humanity remain. He enters the Garden of Eden as a fallen man, not restored to the innocence of the prelapsarian state, which explains why he finds the fair lady so distracting. He frames his perceptions of her and the obstacle she represents through three mythological images. First, he compares her to Proserpine, the young woman who was gathering flowers on the plains of Enna in Sicily when her mother, Ceres, lost her to death. Loving another can be, in a sense, a form of death. The second image is more telling. I do not believe that so great a light shone forth under the lids of Venus, transfixed by her son against all his custom. Here Venus, struck by Cupid's arrows, falls in love. Dante uses this to cast the Garden of Eden as a symbol of desire to return to infancy, to the child-mother state, while recognizing that this fantasy leads nowhere. Finally, the third image is also erotic but emphasizes distance. The river kept us 3 paces apart, but Hellespont, where Xerxes passed it, ever a curb on all human pride, did not suffer more hatred from Leander for its swelling waters between Cestus and Abydos than that from me because it did not open then. An insurmountable barrier separates Matilda from the pilgrim, symbolizing the gap between Dante and his fantasy of the Garden of Eden. He has no choice but to continue forward. He then explains the workings of the Garden of Eden, and the canto closes with a more accessible fantasy, represented as a locus aminus. Dante writes, "They who in olden times sang of the age of gold and its happy state, perhaps in Parnassus, dreamed of this place. Here the root of mankind was innocent. Here is always spring, and every fruit. This is the nectar of which each tells. I turned then right round to my poets, and saw that with a smile they had heard these last words." From Dante's perspective, the perplexity he feels is shared by Virgil and Statius, who know no more than he does. The passage emphasizes both the bucolic quality of the garden and the idea that ancient poets prefigured it in their visions of the Golden Age. Dante establishes a link between their poetic imaginings and his encounter in the garden, transforming it into a pastoral fantasy that intertwines Parnassus and the poetic imagination. From the distraction of Matilda, the narrative moves to Canto 30 and the arrival of a far more significant female figure, Beatrice. Beatrice is associated with the number 3, making her appearance in Canto 30 symbolically appropriate. Her presence in the poem lasts exactly 33 cantos. Her name signifies goodness threefold, and the number 3, expressed as 9, the square of 3, is repeatedly referenced in the Vita Nuova, signaling the arcane importance of her role in the pilgrim's life. Canto 30 presents a double drama, the arrival of Beatrice and the departure of Virgil, a symbolic changing of the guard. The two contrasting moods, the elegiac mourning for Virgil's loss and the sacred awe at Beatrice's appearance, permeate the canto. It begins with singing, Veni, Sponsa, de Libono, echoing the Song of Songs, a sublime love poem that extends the erotic undertones of previous cantos in anticipation of Beatrice. Dante continues, as the blessed at the last trump will rise ready each from his tomb, singing Hallelujah with reclad voice, so upon the divine chariot, ad vocem tanti senes, rose up 100 ministers and messengers of life eternal, who all cried, Benedictus Cavenis. This greeting alludes to the reception of Jesus in Jerusalem, framing Beatrice as entering Dante's story as Christ enters history. She embodies grace, offering the pilgrim the possibility of experiencing divine love directly. Further Latin phrases, including a citation from the Aeneid, honor Virgil, whose role as guide is coming to an end. The excerpt refers to premature death, celebrated elegiac ally in Book 6, when Aeneas descends to Hades to witness the sweep of history. Anchises shows him the shade of Marcellus, a young man who died too soon, prompting the throwing of lilies as a funerary symbol. This image of early death resonates with both Beatrice, who also died prematurely, and Virgil, whose limited vision encompasses only the mortal world. The passage underscores the finite scope of Virgil's guidance, preparing the transition to Beatrice as the new spiritual guide. Virgil is now gone, and a new guide appears. She arrives in elegant dress, evoking the Italian flag. Olive-crowned over a white veil, a lady appeared to me, clad under a green mantle with the hue of living flame, and my spirit, which for so long had trembled in her presence without being overcome, felt through occult virtue that proceeded from her the great power of old love, though my eyes knew nothing more. This moment rewrites the early autobiographical experience of Dante in the Vita Nuova, as he experiences Beatrice through the effects she produces, the courtly love, the sweet new style, the trembling, and the inability to speak. Dante instinctively turns to Virgil for guidance, only to find him vanished, As soon as on my sight the lofty virtue smote which had already pierced me before I was out of boyhood, I turned to the left with the confidence of a little child running to his mother when frightened or in distress, to say to Virgil, "Not a drop of blood is left in me that does not tremble. I know the tokens of the ancient flame." But Virgil had left us bereft of himself. Dante is alarmed, seeking direction, aware of the token of the ancient flame, a metaphor drawn from Dido's encounter with Aeneas in Hades, itself a reflection on death and mortality. Virgil is thus linked to the limits of human passion. Despite their shared history, Dante is now alone, and Virgil belongs to the past. Sensing Dante's distress, Beatrice speaks for the first time in the comedy. "Dante, because Virgil leaves you, do not weep yet, for you must weep for another sword." Like an admiral checking on his men, she directs her eyes to him beyond the stream. Although her veil, encircled with Minerva's leaves, partially obscures her, her regal and stern presence conveys authority. She continues, restraining her words until their full force is delivered. "Look at me well. Indeed I am Beatrice. How did you deign to climb the mountain? Did you not know that here man is happy? This is the first and only time the pilgrim's name is spoken in the poem. He has never been called Dante before, and she will not call him so again." With this moment, the poem shifts from an epic of desire, hope, memory, and justice to an autobiographical account, centered on the singularity of Dante's own experience. Dante emphasizes the necessity of speaking his name at this point. But why? Because speaking of oneself is justified when one seeks to offer an example to others, to transmit experience that might be instructive or protective, or to preserve one's own reputation. In the Convivio, he notes that two exemplary autobiographers are Augustine in the Confessions and Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy. By invoking these models, Dante frames his own self-disclosure as a necessary act, situating his personal experience within a tradition of exemplary autobiography. Canto 31 continues the story of Dante's failures after Beatrice's death, first recounted in the Vita Nuova, when he sought someone to replace her. Dante engages in a confession, an Augustinian moment, marking another step in the autobiographical turn, though his first attempt is hesitant and almost speechless. In an inversion of roles from Canto 5 of the Inferno, Beatrice urges Dante to resume his interrupted admission, as if echoing the confession of failing that Francesca offered in hell. He begins, "After drawing a bitter sigh, I barely had the voice to make answer, and my lips shaped it with difficulty. Weeping, I said, 'The present things, with their false pleasure, turned my steps aside, as soon as your countenance was hidden.'" He finally acknowledges his change of heart following Beatrice's death, allowing her to begin her first act of guidance. "Still, that you may now bear shame for your error, and another time, hearing the sirens, may be stronger, lay aside the seed of tears and listen, so shall you hear how in opposite direction my buried flesh ought to have moved thee." She prepares to teach Dante an ethical lesson. What makes this passage extraordinary is how it illuminates a previously mysterious allegory in Purgatorio. Dante had earlier dreamed of a siren, an allegory of erotic temptation, only to be interrupted by an enigmatic woman who sent the siren away and allowed the journey to continue. Now it is revealed that this woman was none other than Beatrice. Her words also carry a forward-looking caution. The phrase, "another time," suggests that encounters with temptation are not confined to the past but may recur. Dante's conversion, already autobiographical in character, is thus understood as an ongoing journey rather than a completed, one-time event. The future, like the past, is filled with potential trials. In redefining the Augustinian model of conversion as continuous, Dante expresses the anti-pastoral imagination. There is no safe stopping point, no unchallenged truth. Experience is cumulative and forward-looking. Following Cantos 31 and 32, which deal with the Pilgrim's Confession and the allegory of church history, Canto 33, the conclusion of Purgatorio, offers a particularly striking passage, Beatrice's prophecy. Here, the focus shifts from Dante himself to history. She promises a deliverer who will come, not immediately, but at the end of time, suggesting that the poem extends to the very limits of human history. Beatrice, in the role of strict teacher, addresses Dante. From fear and from shame I wish that you henceforth divest yourself, so that you may no more speak like one who is dreaming. Know that the vessel which the serpent broke was, and is not, but let him whose fault it is believe that God's vengeance fears no hindrance. Not for all time shall be without an heir the eagle that left its feathers on the chariot, whereby it became a monster and then a prey. For I see surely, and therefore I tell of it, stars already close at hand, secure from all check and hindrance, that shall bring us a time wherein a 510 and 5, sent by God, shall slay the thievish woman, with that giant who sins with her. And perhaps my prophecy, obscure as Themis and Sphinx, persuades you less because, after their fashion, it darkens your mind. But soon the facts shall be the naiads that will solve this hard enigma, without loss of flocks or of harvest. Through this enigmatic vision of the future, Beatrice conveys both warning and promise. Its obscurity heightens the tension, leaving Dante, and the reader, with a sense of fear, speculation, and anticipation about what the prophecy will ultimately mean. In my view, this prophetic imagery draws heavily from the book of Revelation in the Bible, which I believe exerted a strong influence on Dante's poetic imagination. Anyone familiar with my earlier videos exploring Revelation in depth will likely recognize several parallels in both language and symbolism. When Beatrice speaks of the thievish woman whom God will strike down, the image recalls the whore of Babylon, the figure who sits upon the scarlet beast with 7 heads. In Revelation, this woman embodies an end-time political and spiritual power, often identified with a final Babylon, while the 7 heads represent 7 kingdoms united in rebellion against God under the dominion of Satan. Revelation also describes how the kings of the earth commit spiritual fornication with Babylon, the mother of prostitutes, who holds a golden cup filled with the abominations of the world. She stands in direct opposition to God's people. By contrast, Scripture presents another woman, the woman clothed with the sun, who is pregnant and whose child is threatened by the dragon, Satan. Yet she is protected by God. This woman symbolizes the heavenly Jerusalem, the community of God's people throughout history. She gives birth to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and later Revelation portrays the Church as the bride of Christ and the wife of God. Together, these images represent all who are destined for heaven, the faithful who live according to the commandments of God and follow Christ. Beatrice's mention of flocks and harvest further strengthens this biblical connection. Jesus is frequently described as the shepherd, and his followers as sheep, while those who belong to Satan are often portrayed as goats. Harvest imagery is also central to Revelation, where Christ appears on the clouds holding a sickle, coming to reap the earth. Those who belong to God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the Church, the bride of Christ, true believers, are depicted as the grain harvest. Those who align themselves with evil and commit spiritual fornication with Babylon are depicted as the grape harvest, crushed in the winepress, a symbol of divine judgment and the final destruction of wickedness. At the center of the prophecy is a numerical symbol written as 500, 10, and 5, 515. In medieval thought, numbers were seen as containing the essence of creation itself. Thinkers such as Isidore of Seville claimed that if a number were removed from a thing, that thing would fall apart. Over the centuries, speculations about the meaning of this specific number have sometimes been quite amusing. Some argued that it referred to the year 1315, reasoning that 800 marked the year Charlemagne declared the Holy Roman Empire, and adding 515 gives 1315. By this logic, Dante would have been predicting an event in his own time, though nothing in the text supports such a reading. Another interpretation was even more absurd, rearranging the Roman numerals DXV, 515, to spell Deux, the Italian word for leader, led some to claim Dante was foretelling Mussolini's rise. Clearly, this is fanciful nonsense. A more convincing explanation comes from 2 historians who examined medieval illustrations of the Roman Catholic Mass. During a part of the Mass known as the antiphonal prayer, which celebrates Christ's sacramental coming, the phrase, "It is truly right and just," in Latin, via dignum et justum est, features the letter V brought into contact with an X, forming a cross that unites the human, V for uomo, with the divine, D for Dio. In this interpretation, Beatrice's enigmatic prophecy signals the apocalyptic end of time, when Christ will return to earth. The first coming, as a human, is symbolized by the number 5, while the second coming reveals Christ's divinity, with humanity and divinity joined by the cross. This interpretation, proposed by R. E. Karsk and G. R. Ciroli, is insightful, though not without its complications. If Dante's prophecy reflects a belief in the imminent end of time, he could be understood as a Jochist. In Paradiso, a figure named Joachim of Flora presents a tripartite theory of history: the age of the Father, from creation to the patriarchs; the age of the Son, from the Incarnation to roughly 1260, Joachim's own era; and the age of the Spirit, extending from 1260 to a future time when fraternal orders will dissolve human institutions and humanity will live in brotherhood and chastity without marriage or state. However, embracing Joachim's vision was controversial, even heretical, because it seemed to divide the unity of the Trinity into 3 separate ages. Bonaventure, a major theologian of Dante's time, whom Dante will meet in Paradiso, explicitly declared Joachim's ideas heretical. Thus, if Dante's prophecy truly alludes to Christ's second coming and the messianic restoration, it raises a provocative question: is Dante, in this sense, a heretical, apocalyptic writer? Dante's concern with institutions suggests that he is far from being an apocalyptic writer. There is no poet who shows greater care for institutions or treats them as integral to history. He critiques the empire, the church, the law, and the family, but only because he believes they must be revitalized and improved. His attacks are never a denial of their importance. Rather, they reflect a profound recognition of the enduring role these institutions play in human history. If he is not apocalyptic, then what is his prophecy? The reference to the second coming remains, but Dante strips away the usual Jochist imagery and details that typically accompany such prophecies. His vision does not concern the now of history or events imminent in linear time. It points instead to a temporal horizon beyond human comprehension. This distancing from immediate history adds a necessary complexity to the prophetic image, preventing it from becoming too neat or literal. This prophecy of the end of times marks the climax of Purgatorio. After it, Dante undergoes a ritual immersion in 2 rivers: the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and the river Uno, the river of good memories. This ritual recalls the cleansing at the beginning of the journey, when Dante washed his face and girded his loins with a reed that grew spontaneously on the shore. The 2 rivers flow from the same source and, like 2 fond companions, separate only slowly, remaining intertwined. Memory and forgetfulness coexist, so that no erasure occurs without preserving a trace of recollection, and every memory contains an element of forgetting. The final lines of Purgatorio echo the conclusion of Inferno: I came forth from the most holy waves, renovated even as new trees renewed with new foliage, pure and ready to rise to the stars. Dante is now fully prepared to continue his journey. At the summit of Mount Purgatory, he will soon ascend with the swiftness of lightning to the moon, where he begins the planetary and cosmological journey of Paradiso.